requires difficult decisions on tax, which is why we are asking employers to contribute more. Stabilising the public finances is the only way to create long-term stability in which businesses can thrive. The Government does recognise the need to protect the smallest businesses, which is why we have more than doubled the employment allowance to £10,500, meaning more than half of small businesses will either gain or be unaffected.
Sit down.
Susan Murray. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents has told me about one of their clients who's a business care home owner, which is facing an increase in their operating costs of £70,000 a year as a result of the national insurance increase. Most of their caring staff work on a part-time basis, which suits their family circumstances. However, for each part-time member of staff, the business must pay an additional £615 per year as a result of the change to the national insurance contribution thresholds in the Government's October budget. In Bartonshire and across the UK, there's a growing demand for social care. So, what is the Government going to do to help businesses in the care sector who've been hit by these increased staffing costs at a time when there are significant rises?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the honourable member from Mid and Bartonshire and members on all sides of this House will join me in paying tribute to Scotland's social care workers for the incredible contribution that they make. Social care is, of course, a devolved issue. The Scottish Government has now received the largest budget settlement in the whole history of devolution, in addition to support for additional employer national insurance costs. They can choose to, and indeed I very much hope they do, deliver additional support for social care.
You'll stand by.
Speaker, the impact of NIC changes in the budget is £5.2 billion more for Scotland. Record funding to invest in our NHS, protect the successes of devolution and fix our local services. But the Scottish Government have squandered the latter opportunity by continuing to underfund our councils, leaving Falkirk Council with a £28 million hole to plug after 8 years of SNP control. Does the Minister agree with me that the £5.2 billion secured for Scotland by these benches could have been used to fix local government, but instead the SNP have chosen to leave the people of Falkirk to pick up the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only do I agree with my honourable friend that the SNP government is at risk of squandering this historic opportunity for Scotland, I suggest the SNP government might like to ask their members of Parliament opposite why they voted against this historic budget in Scotland's interests.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Samir Khan.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow marks 13 years since 6 young British soldiers were on patrol in Afghanistan when their vehicle was struck by an explosive, tragically killing them all. Sergeant Nigel Coop was 33. Corporal Jake Hartley was 20. Private Anthony Frampton was 20. Private Daniel Wade was 20. Private Daniel Wilford was 21. And Private Christopher Kershaw was just 19, a teenager. Tomorrow also marks the 18th anniversary of the death of Benjamin Reddy, a 22-year-old serving with 42 Commando Royal Marines, killed in Helmand Provost in 2007. These men fought and died for their country, our country. And across the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, 642 individuals died fighting for Britain alongside our allies. Many more were wounded. We will never forget their bravery and their sacrifice. And I know the whole House will join in me in remembering them and all those who serve our country. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Samir Khan.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly made growth his key mission, but can he outline for my constituents in Southampton Test how our Employment Rights Bill will not only deliver improvements for them, but also put more money in their pockets as part of our plan?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. She's doing a fantastic job for her constituents. The Employment Rights Bill is the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation. It will benefit more than 10 million workers in every corner of the country. It will tackle low pay, poor conditions and poor job security that hold our country back. It is pro-worker, pro-business and pro-growth.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bernal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Divisions between Ukraine and the US only serve Vladimir Putin. President Zelensky is right to try and rebuild his relationship with President Trump. He is keeping a cool head under very difficult circumstances, and I was glad to see President Trump receive his letter positively. What is the Prime Minister doing to help rebuild their relationship after a challenging week?
Minister.
Well, she's absolutely right that we need to do everything we can to ensure that the US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace. And I'm doing everything I can to play my part in that, in regular contact with all of the key players at the moment, including talking to President Zelensky yesterday afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. All of us in this House know that the British Armed Forces are a huge source of pride to our country. They put themselves in harm's way to defend our values. As the opposition, we support efforts to resolve this conflict, but we cannot write a blank cheque. If British peacekeeping troops in Ukraine were attacked, whether directly or via proxies, we could be drawn into conflict with Russia. Can the Prime Minister reassure all those who are concerned about the UK being drawn into war?
Minister.
Yes, that's the last thing anybody wants to see. And the whole point of ensuring that there's a lasting peace and that any deal, if there's a deal, is defended, is to avoid conflict, to ensure that we do have peace. The way to ensure we have peace is to ensure there are guarantees for any deal that is in place, because the surest risk that there will be conflict is if Putin thinks that he can breach any deal that may be arrived at.
The Prime Minister is quite right, and we on this side of the House agree with him. The objective for his visit to Washington was to get that US security guarantee for Ukraine, and I commend his efforts in this very difficult task. But nonetheless, on Monday, the United States withdrew military aid for Ukraine. Can he update the House on the steps he is taking to persuade America that it is also in their national interest to provide a security guarantee?
Prime Minister.
I'm pleased to inform the House that on Thursday of last week we did discuss security guarantees. The President made absolutely clear his commitment to Article 5 of NATO, absolutely clear that he would have our backs because of the relationship between our parties, and agreed that our teams would sit down together to talk through security guarantees. I've spoken to him, I think, 3 times since then on the telephone, because it is vitally important that we work with the US, with Europe and Ukraine and make sure that if there is a deal, it has proper security guarantees in place.
Kemi Bernal.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is not able to comment on specific intelligence matters, and I'm certainly not asking him to do that. However, there are concerning reports that the United States has instructed Britain to suspend intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and other reports that Five Eyes itself may be at risk. We need to make sure America does not disengage. There are some in this House who argue Europe should go it alone. But does he agree with me that without this country's greatest ally, any peace agreement would place a terrible burden on Britain and our taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with her wholeheartedly, and that's why in the debate we had just 2 days ago, I've always been clear that we need to ensure that the US, the UK, Europe and Ukraine are working together, but we must not choose between the US and Europe. We never have historically, and we're not going to do so now.
Kemi Bernal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on that. He will know that it is not just the security situation that worries people. They are also concerned about trade wars and the economic impact of tariffs, like those levelled on Canada and Mexico yesterday. The best way to avoid America putting tariffs on Britain is to reach agreement on a US trade deal. Following the Prime Minister's trip to Washington, have talks on a UK-US trade deal begun?
Prime Minister.
Well, I was pleased in the meeting I had last week that we did discuss an economic deal and agreed that our teams would indeed sit down rapidly to talk through an economic deal, and that is what they're doing, because, as she rightly says, that is far better than getting drawn into conflict in relation to tariffs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Prime Minister has confirmed that those talks have started. People across our country are worried. They're worried about national security. They're worried about whether we can equip our military fast enough. They are worried about whether we will deploy troops in Ukraine and whether we will be able to keep the peace. They are also worried about our economic security. Can we afford all this? The world is changing fast, and we need an entirely new approach to our economy and our energy security. The budget last year halted growth with higher taxes and higher borrowing. Yesterday, farmers were protesting in Whitehall again. People are hurting. Will he now change course so we can have the economic security we know we need for our national security?
Prime Minister.
We were doing so well. What we inherited was insecurity in our economy. We inherited a £22 billion black hole, and we have now turned that around. We've got the highest investment coming into our economy. We've got wages higher than prices. We've got 3 times interest rates have been cut. That's the difference between stability with Labour and instability with the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his decisive leadership that he has shown in Europe and at home to bolster our collective security. The £13.4 billion increase in defence spending has been very much welcomed in my constituency of Stevenage. Can the Prime Minister outline how that increase in defence spending will boost jobs and growth in places like Stevenage, and would he like to join me in visiting some of those businesses?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Our plan for change is built on national security, and that has to go hand in hand with economic security. And as we're returning to 2.5% for the first time since a Labour government, that investment must mean UK skills, UK jobs and UK apprenticeships. And I was very pleased that on Monday we were able to announce a new hub, a new spending targets to help 12,000 SMEs access the supply chain, which will boost economic growth, and that'll be really important in so many constituencies. And of course I'll consider his invitation.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I visited Kingston's Army Reserve Centre, met members of the Royal Army Medical Service who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan very bravely. So can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's initial remarks? On Monday, the Prime Minister rightly said a minerals deal only was not a sufficient security guarantee for Ukraine. But since then, the Trump administration has said that a minerals deal is the only guarantee on the table, and President Trump has removed military aid from Ukraine and said that the British cannot share American intelligence with Kyiv. Both those decisions mean more brave Ukrainians will die and further embolden Vladimir Putin. So can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he still believe that President Trump is a reliable ally? And if Ukraine does not get a sufficient security guarantee from this White House, what is the Prime Minister's plan B?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, look, we work very closely with the United States on defence, on security and on intelligence. We have done for many, many years. We're intertwined, and of course they're a reliable ally. We are operating on that basis day in, day out across the world, as he knows. In relation to the situation as it develops, obviously our main focus, our only focus, is on a lasting peace in Ukraine. There are many moving parts, there are many discussions to be had, but what I'm doing is staying focused on what I think is the single most important outcome, which is a lasting peace in Ukraine, which is good for Ukraine, for Europe, and of course essential for the United Kingdom.
Sir Ed Davey.
The Prime Minister knows we all support him in that effort. But can I take him back to President Trump's reliability? 4 British women have accused Andrew Tate of rape and human trafficking. and British police have issued arrest warrants. The Tates have tried to escape justice, first to Romania and now to the United States, but I'm delighted that Florida has thankfully opened a criminal investigation. But does the Prime Minister agree that people who are wanted by British police of such appalling crimes should stand trial in our country? And given his assessment that President Trump really is a reliable ally, will his government request an urgent extradition of the Tate brothers?
Prime Minister.
This is a live issue, as he'll appreciate, and therefore I'll tread carefully. But the principle is absolutely clear. Justice must be done in all cases, including in this case. But I won't go into the details because this is a live case, as he knows.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm supporting many parents in Exeter who are struggling to get the support they need for their children within the SEND system run by Devon County Council. One parent told me that their child was excelling, but after undergoing major surgery, she needed additional support to get back into a mainstream school setting. That hasn't been possible due to the disarray of the SEND system in Devon, and this child is now missing out. I welcome the new money going to the system. Can the Prime Minister provide an update on government work that will also reform the SEND system to make sure every child in Exeter has the best start in life?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank him for raising this familiar topic. We inherited a SEND system that failed to meet the needs of children and families, and that's why we're investing £1 billion in SEND alongside £740 million for councils to improve inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools and to make sure special schools can cater for children with the most complex needs. We're working closely with partners in Devon to deliver an accelerated progress plan and have deployed SEND advisors to offer support to the local authority.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
By cozying up to Putin, Trump is making Europe less safe. We all recognise the need for Europe to adapt. Germany is changing its fiscal rules to boost investment in defence and infrastructure, creating a €500 billion fund to strengthen its future. Will the Prime Minister please consider a similar approach, focusing on strategic investment rather than imposing further hardship on the poorest through cuts to welfare and cuts to international aid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as she knows, I think it's very important if we're to increase defence spending, which we are, to have that fully costed, fully funded, and to put that plan before the House, which is what I did last week. But she talks about fiscal rules, she talks about funding. I have to say, it was highly regrettable that Plaid voted against £1.6 billion to fund public services in Wales. She needs to explain how that helps her constituents and the people of Wales.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year marks 40 years since the Swan Report exposed systemic racism and discrimination in the education system. And regrettably, none of those recommendations were implemented. One of the most damning injustices in that report was the misclassification of mainly black children as educationally subnormal, as identified in Steve McKean's BBC documentary. And given the historic nature of this and the impact it had on so many, will the Prime Minister consider a public inquiry to provide justice and recompense for those who have been affected?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this really important issue. All children, young people, must be treated fairly, and there's no place for hate or prejudice in our education system. I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this further.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, President Trump has ended military aid to Ukraine, reportedly banned the UK share in US intelligence for Ukraine, and is now seeking to lift sanctions with Russia to appease Vladimir Putin, a murderous, lying dictator. Regrettably, it's clear for now the US can no longer be relied upon for security and peace in Europe. So will the Prime Minister provide leadership to our allies by urgently making the decision to be the first leader to release seized Russian state assets to Ukraine under the established principle of international law, so that Putin must pay as the aggressor?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the question of assets, obviously we're using the profits, the interest on the assets, to help fund Ukraine, and we are looking with others at whether it's possible to go further, and obviously I'll update the House if that's possible. But I have to say, at a time when defence and security in Europe, in the UK, needs to be ramped up for all the reasons that he readily understands, for the SNP to maintain its position that it wants to get rid of the single most effective deterrent that we have, the nuclear deterrent, really has to be explained in its historical context.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour is rolling out free breakfast clubs in primary schools, starting with 750 schools, including Scapegoat Hill Junior Infants School in my constituency. Under the Tories, only 1 in 10 schools had these clubs. Labour will make them available for all children. This will help break down barriers to opportunity for every child. I know the Prime Minister is as determined as I am to tear away the link between background and success. So will you update the House on how we are going to do that through Labour's plan for change?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Labour promised free breakfast clubs in every primary school, and the first 750 will open in April, giving every child the best start in life through our plan for change. It will also put up to £450 a year back in the pockets of working families. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, to say that 2 of the breakfast clubs will be opening in the constituency of the Leader of the Opposition in April, and I hope she'll welcome them when they do.
Ian Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the Prime Minister talked about creating defence jobs across the country as we rebuild our defence industrial capacity. So will he and the government bring forward an urgent plan for skills in the defence sector? And does he agree with his Education Secretary that the strategy for defence skills should sit purely under the Department for Education and an underpowered executive agency?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this because it is a duty to increase our spending on defence and security, but it also does provide an opportunity for jobs across the country, and that's good jobs, well-paid jobs, skilled jobs, as he rightly identifies, but also jobs with a real sense of pride, and we are working on that.
Emma Lulberg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My lovely granddad, John Henry Richardson, passed away in 1998 from work-related asbestos exposure. Today in South Shields, we have one of the highest death rates from this silent killer in the United Kingdom. Will the Prime Minister please look at introducing a national digital register so we know where this asbestos is and commit to a phased removal of it from public buildings?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm sure I speak for the whole House when I say I'm very sorry to hear what happened to her grandfather. These are just awful cases, and the deaths are terrible. I've no doubt he was a wonderful man. He would have been, no doubt, very proud to have seen her in her place today. And I'll make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Sir Oliver Dundon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St Hilda's Girls' School looks set to join Emmanuel Jewish Prep as the second school in Bushey alone forced to close because of Labour's VAT hike. This is a double hit to aspiration. First, the parents, many of whom not wealthy, who have described the significant sacrifices they have made to send their children to these schools. And secondly, to the excellent local state schools, including the one that I attended, which simply do not have the places, meaning this policy won't even save money. So may I therefore urge the Prime Minister, even at this late stage, to look again at the failures in this policy.
Prime Minister.
I don't doubt the aspirations of all parents in relation to their children. But I mean all parents. What we've been able to do is to make sure we release the funding to ensure that our state secondary schools have the teachers they need. And there's no point the party opposite pretending that they're interested in state education when they left them without the teaching they needed.
Dr. Ray Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is no punchline. I presume something was said that shouldn't have been said. I'm sure the member would like to withdraw what was said, if they've anything about them. Withdrawn. There we are. Let's carry on. Dr. Maria Timbon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 48 children that we know of have been killed by known domestically abusive parents during court-permitted contact visits, including Paul and Jack Seitz, who were tragically murdered at the hands of their father in a house fire. Their mother, my constituent Claire Throssell, has campaigned against the presumption of contact, which allows such abusers to have unsupervised contact with their children. Will the Prime Minister meet with Claire and I to discuss the urgent need to remove the presumption of contact in law?
Prime Minister. Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend and to my honourable friend, the member for Calder Valley, who've both raised this critical issue? And can I particularly pay tribute to Claire? Her courage and strength is outstanding. Mr. Speaker, family courts must never be used as a tool that domestic abusers can use to continue their appalling abuse. And we're expanding a number of pathfinder courts to protect the welfare of children and reviewing the presumption of involvement that she raises.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Daniel Coffey from Columpton lost his life while serving in Iraq. His grandfather said yesterday that Vice President J.D. Vance should have a lot more respect for those who lost their lives, in response to the Vance comment that some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. Will the Prime Minister gently remind the US government the UK was there for the US following the 9/11 attacks when Lord Robertson invoked Article 5, and that we were there for the US for the intervention in Iraq, and they might remember our long-standing friendship when we think about security guarantees for Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this, and I know he speaks for the whole House. We do remember the role that we've played historically with our allies, and we particularly remember those that made the ultimate sacrifice in that duty for their country and for our allies, and that's why it's so important that we make that point today.
Parin.
Muraz Gul Peran Lowen. Happy St Piran's Day, Mr. Speaker. To the hundreds of thousands of people in Cornwall and around the world who are today celebrating St Piran's Day, will the Prime Minister confirm our government's commitment to national minority status for Cornwall, and will he join me in wishing Cornish folk the world over a very happy St Piran's Day?
Prime Minister.
Well, yes, let me wish him, his constituents and everyone in Cornwall a very happy St Piran's Day. We do recognise Cornish national minority status, not just the language, the history and the culture of Cornwall, but its bright future. And I know that he and Cornish colleagues will continue to be powerful voices for Cornwall.
Sir David Davis.
Four weeks ago, the Northern Ireland coroner accused British soldiers of unlawful killing after they engaged with IRA would-be murderers. After careful reading, as far as I can see, this judgment was based on no evidence whatsoever. Over 100 Special Forces soldiers have been summoned before these inquiries. Not one IRA leader has been summoned in the same way. Soldiers that serve our country with honour, heroism and skill are being punished in their declining years for doing nothing but carrying out their patriotic duty in the face of enormous risks. Now, given how he opened his comments today, which I associate myself with, does he not think that he and his government have a duty to protect these soldiers from such partisan parodies of justice in their declining years?
On the particular case, the coroner's ruling, I just haven't seen the details, I'm afraid, so I can't comment on that. On the broader point, it's right that we should protect those who serve our country, wherever they serve our country. Getting the balance right is critically important. I didn't think that the legislation that was put forward by the party opposite achieved that, but nonetheless, I do believe that in the interests of everybody in Northern Ireland, all those who served and all those who are victims, we do need to renew our efforts to find a way forward on this really important issue.
Helena Dollywell.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents in Hastings Rye and the villages are fed up with the constant failures of Southern Water, dumping sewage in our sea, flooding and leaving us without water for days, all while taking huge bonuses. At the Environment Select Committee, we've been hauling in the water bosses one by one and hearing about their failures. But the boss of Southern Water there finally agreed to give my constituents millions in compensation for a major water outage. Can the Prime Minister tell me how this Labour government is cracking down on the bad behaviour of the water industry?
Can I applaud her for her dedicated work on the Environment Committee and obviously in her constituency. Last week, our Water Act became law, which gives new powers to ban the payment of bonuses for polluting water bosses and bringing criminal charges against lawbreakers. We are determined, Mr. Speaker, to fix our broken water system after years of companies pumping sewage into our waterways and infrastructure not keeping pace with demand.
Willie Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for his efforts to bring Europe together and ensure we can work to restore peace in Ukraine. What the war in Ukraine has also demonstrated, though, is the need for greater food security and stronger supply chains. But if this government forces our farmers to sell their land because of the divisive family farm tax, then it undermines this. So ahead of the spring statement, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, will he think this policy through again and seek to end it? Because national security needs food security, it needs farming and it needs farmers.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we put a record amount in the budget into farming, £5 billion. We've set out a roadmap for farming, which has been welcomed across by the NFU. And as she knows, the vast majority of farms will not be affected by the provisions that we're putting in place.
Lead picture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months, my constituents in Doncaster East and Isle of Axholme have been telling me how fed up they are with not being able to get an appointment because of the 8 a.m. scramble. The last thing they need when they're ill is to have to pick up that phone and wait and fight again to be first. It's great news that the government's new GP contract will start to resolve this. But can the Prime Minister reassure my residents who can't use technology that they will still be able to book an appointment?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for this. Last week, for the first time in 4 years, the BMA agreed the GP contract with the government worth an extra £889 million. Patients will be able to request appointments online from October, but I can absolutely reassure my honourable friend and others that this will free up the phones for those who need them most and help end the 8 a.m. scramble.
Rosie Duffy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under his Labour government, does the Prime Minister believe the UK's estimated 3 million millionaires should contribute more to our vital national security? Or is it just the world's poorest, by no longer benefiting from our international aid programmes, or the shameful almost 6 million children living in poverty in this country who should be paying for it? What happened to the wealth tax, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think all should and all do make a contribution at this vital time.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are delicate moments for the country, and the Prime Minister has led with British values, moral courage, decency, as a true statesman, and with skilled and careful diplomacy. All elected politicians in this House, Mr. Speaker, must appreciate that everything we say could impact that diplomacy. Does the Prime Minister agree that a united House could help us achieve that lasting peace?
Well, let me broaden out his words to the whole House, because I do think that it's hugely to the credit of this House that it is speaking loudly in a united way with one voice in the face of Russian aggression. And that is why we must have lasting peace based on the sovereignty and security of Ukraine. But it certainly helps to all of those observing across the world to see this House speaking powerfully with one voice, united across these benches, and I'm very pleased that we're able to continue in that way.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish fishing industry, by volume and value, is the biggest in these islands. And within my constituency, the port towns of Peterhead and Fraserburgh represent a very large share of that industry in terms of the land it catch and its processing. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister enjoys the occasional fish supper. So does he agree that their interests and their future must be secured and enhanced as his government pursues economic growth and resets its relationship with the European Union, especially through the forthcoming trade and cooperation agreement negotiations, so that the jobs of the people who work in this sector can never be made expendable for the sake of some other interest.
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you for raising this, and do recognise the huge and historic importance of the fishing industry in his constituency and others. I'm determined to make the sector more secure, sustainable and economically successful. We've already secured over 720,000 tonnes of fishing quota for the year, worth up to £920 million, including agreements with the EU and with Norway. We also want to tackle problems about labour shortages that he will be familiar with. I'm pleased that his constituents in Peterhead will benefit from £20 million under our plan for neighbourhood, but absolutely do everything we can in relation to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Medway Maritime Hospital in my constituency of Gillingham and Raynham has today received a very concerning CQC report following an inspection of the emergency department in February last year. Testimonies include patients having to wait up to 50 hours to be seen, and others being told to soil themselves because there were staff that were not available to take them to the bathroom. Will the Prime Minister please outline what this government will urgently do to tackle the crisis in our NHS after 14 years of absolute Tory mismanagement?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank her for raising this case. Her constituents deserve the highest standard of care. The party opposite left the NHS in an absolutely dire state. We're investing £26 billion, and our reform plan will cut waiting lists. And I'm really pleased, Mr. Speaker, to say that waiting lists are down, and we've delivered over 2 million extra appointments to get the NHS back on its feet.
Final question, Richard Holden.
Thank you very much. A marriage between first cousins carries significant health issues, many of which aren't even knowable until post-birth. When practiced generation after generation, there is a significant multiplier effect. In addition, the real impacts for the openness of our society and women's rights in our country are also significant. After all, there are significant dynamics in sharing the same set of grandparents. On Friday, this government has a choice to let my bill go through to ban first cousin marriage to committee stage. Will the Prime Minister think again before instructing his whips to block this legislation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've taken our position on that bill. Thank you.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Right, we now come to the statement. Lord Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will make a statement on capacity in the Crown Court. When this government took office 8 months ago, we received an inheritance from those opposite that was little short of disgraceful. Our prisons were in crisis, on the edge of collapse, and our courts faced a record and rising backlog. While the crisis in our prisons was more obvious and visible, the harm caused by the backlog in our courts cannot be overestimated. Today, the backlog stands at over 73,000 cases. Just 5 years earlier, it had been half of that figure. We should stop and consider that fact, because the backlog is far more than a number. Behind each case is a victim. Many have waited years for justice. and some will now not have their cases heard until 2028. With delays this long, it is little wonder that more victims are dropping out. And tragically, this is true of victims of the most heinous crimes. Just 5 years ago, around 3% of adult rape victims whose cases were due to go to trial dropped out before their case was heard. Today, that figure has more than doubled. Mr. Speaker, an old adage has sadly come true in this country. For far too many, justice delayed is justice denied. Unlike our predecessors who allowed this backlog to rise and rise, this government will bear down on it. We will deliver swifter justice for the victims of crime, and that starts today with a record investment in our criminal courts. Mr. Speaker, each financial year the government determines the total number of days that can be sat across all our courts and tribunals, commonly referred to as sitting days. This process is called the Concordat, and last year I committed to concluding the process earlier than in previous years to give our courts greater certainty. We have now done so several months ahead of last year's settlement. And so today, I can announce that this government will provide a total budget of £2.5 billion for our courts and tribunals in the next financial year. Mr. Speaker, this represents a record level of investment. It will fund up to 110,000 sitting days in our Crown Courts. This is 4,000 more days than the previous government funded last year. And if the Shadow Minister opposite would like to check the record books, he will find no higher allocation in recorded history. Beyond the Crown Court, investment in the family and civil courts brings those jurisdictions at or close to their maximum capacity. And this investment in court capacity is matched by an investment in court maintenance. Our courts have been allowed to fall into a shocking state of disrepair in recent years. And so this government will boost funding to £148.5 million, up from £128 million last year. This will be the highest figure spent on maintenance and capital works in the last 10 years. Mr. Speaker, this builds on a consistent theme of this new government and a marked difference when compared to our predecessors. In our first 8 months in office, we have consistently invested more in the courts than the last Conservative government. On entering office, I immediately funded 500 sitting days on top of the allocation provided by the previous Lord Chancellor. At the end of last year, when resources allowed, I added a further 2,000. In October, this government also increased magistrates' court sentencing powers. Previously, they could only impose a 6-month prison sentence, and we lifted this to 12 months. In doing so, we freed up capacity in the Crown Court to hear the most serious cases. This single change was equivalent to adding another 2,000 sitting days in our Crown Courts. Mr. Speaker, all these changes are necessary for the swift delivery of justice. However, I must be honest in a way that my predecessors never were. This investment is necessary but not sufficient to reduce the Crown Court backlog. Even with record levels of funding, if we do not take other bolder measures, the backlog will grow. With a growing number of cases entering our courts and with cases of increasing complexity being heard in front of our judges, we cannot simply do more of the same. We must do things differently. So in December, I appointed Sir Brian Leveson, one of our most distinguished judges, to conduct a wholesale review of our criminal courts. The review will propose long-term reform, as well as reviewing the efficiency and timeliness of court processes from charge all the way to case completion. But crucially, I've also asked him to address something that too many others have avoided, the question of structural reform. Today, 10% of criminal cases are heard in a Crown Court, where a judge presides and a jury decides. Mr. Speaker, jury trials are a pillar of our justice system for the most serious offences, and that will never change. However, we must ask ourselves whether there are cases that we are hearing today that could be handled equally well elsewhere. There are already some cases that can be heard in either a Crown or a Magistrates' Court. We call these trialable either way cases. Today, they represent 40% of the court's backlog. But while a conviction, whether determined by a jury or a magistrate, is the same, regardless of the type of courtroom, the demand that they place on our justice system is very different indeed. An either-way case is resolved by magistrates 5 times faster than before a judge and jury. Now, justice must be done. Criminals must always face consequences. On that, I know this House will agree. But we must be willing to ask whether a judge and jury should be occupied at great length and expense on crimes that could be dealt with more swiftly elsewhere. For that reason, I've asked Sir Brian to consider the case for reclassifying some less serious offences, whether magistrate sentencing powers are sufficient, and the case for a new court to sit between the magistrates and the Crown. Sir Brian's recommendations will come later this spring. His goal and mine are one: to bear down on the backlog and deliver swifter justice for victims. The consequences of failing to do so are all too clear. The backlog in the criminal courts will rise. Cases will be listed even further into the future. More victims of crime will decide the wait is too painful with justice so distant, and as a result, dangerous criminals will walk free. So today we have announced a record investment in our courts. 110,000 sitting days funded, 4,000 more than the previous administration. For many victims, their case will be heard sooner. But if we are to deliver swifter justice for all, we must embrace reform too. This government will deliver once-in-a-generation reform of our courts. We will reverse the decline and the delays of the last Conservative government, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. I can always help by reopening Chorley Court for you. Right, let us come to this young Lord Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's great to see the Justice Secretary back in the country after her holiday in Texas. If she can find time to travel to America, why can't she find time to travel to the 2 Category A prisons that the independent... well, I'd be pleased to hear from the Right Honourable Lady that's the case. That wasn't the answer to our written parliamentary question the other day. But, Mr. Speaker, today, the Central Criminal Court has 13 courtrooms sat empty. In Preston, 40% of courtrooms sit empty. In Winchester, it's 2/3. And as a result of the court backlog, that has grown under the Justice Secretary. We need to be maximising court capacity, taking full advantage of all available days, and probing the judiciary for options to create more capacity. I know that. I'd like to believe that the Right Honourable Lady knows that. But how did we get here? Well, we got here because... No. We got here because, just like every other area of this Labour government, it came to office with no plan whatsoever. And it has wasted its first 8 months in office. Upon entering office, the Lady Chief Justice informed the Justice Secretary there were at least 6,500 sitting days available to address the court backlog. The Lord Chancellor responded by adding a measly 500 sitting days. The court backlog kept growing. So frustrated was the Lady Chief Justice that she came to Parliament in November and took the unusual step of publicly chastising the Justice Secretary, and she reiterated her offer of 6,500 sitting days. The Justice Secretary responded a month later by adding 2,000 sitting days. The court backlog kept growing. And here we are, again, 8 months on from the Justice Secretary taking office, on the very day the Public Accounts Committee published an excoriating report into her department to promise more sitting days. So, Mr. Speaker, is it third time lucky for the Justice Secretary? No. What we've learned again today is that the Justice Secretary is still turning down available sitting days. And astonishingly, she has conceded that the court backlog will keep on rising. This is simply not acceptable. So, of course, I welcome the changes made by the Justice Secretary, but it is not enough. She says that victims will get quicker justice. Well, tell that to the victims of rape who are having their court cases listed for 2028.
Order. Please, I need to be able to hear it. When you shout, when the front bench is shouting so long I can't hear, I'll decide whether it's in order or not. Are we understanding each other? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't pretend that cutting the court backlog is easy, although it will be quick. But the Secretary of State owes the country a plan and a timetable for when the backlog is actually going to fall. This morning, she was repeatedly asked, but refused to give an answer. So can she tell the country now? When will the court backlog begin to fall? By what date does her department forecast it falling? And why will she not take up the 2,500 additional sitting days offered time and time again by the Lady Chief Justice? And lastly, turning to the new sentencing guidelines that's been published alongside this statement, which will make a custodial sentence less likely for, and I quote, ethnic minorities, cultural minorities, and faith minority communities. Why is the Justice Secretary enshrining this double standard, this two-tier approach to sentencing? This is an inversion of the rule of law. We on this side of the House believe in equality under the law. Why doesn't she?
So state.
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State asked the question, how did we get here? I'll tell him how we got here. His administration and the 14 years they had in power and the absolute mess they made of the criminal justice system, a mess that this government is clearing up. I'm sorry to deprive him of what I'm sure he thought was a clever attack line on my recent visit to Texas. I can inform him I have in fact visited Manchester Prison. I did so during the February recess. And
please. I did say to the side, I do need to hear, so please.
And he should welcome us seeking to learn from a tough law and order state in America where they had the same problems that we inherited from his administration 20 years ago, and where they've embarked on criminal justice reform that has seen levels of reoffending a low level that we could only dream of thus far in this country. So he should seek to learn from other countries as we are doing. If his government had done so when they were in power, we wouldn't have such a big mess to clear up in the criminal justice system. He refers to courtrooms sitting empty. One of the reasons why so many of those courtrooms have been sitting empty is because his government, one of their last acts on leaving office, was to only fund 106,000 sitting days. I have lifted that amount. Today is a record number of Crown Court sitting days, the highest ever that will be funded by this Labour government. So more of those courtrooms are, of course, going to be put to use. He will also know that in order to run the system efficiently, there will always be some courtrooms not in use so that they can cope with the influxes of demand. That is the normal practice for how we run. But more courtrooms, as a result of this decision today, will be in use than was ever the case under his administration. He asks me what I have been doing and what is the plan. Well, let me tell him, when I first came into office, the first thing I did was increase the number of sitting days by 500. His government left office at 106,000. I increased it immediately. I then made a further allocation and increased again by another 2,000 before Christmas, making progress on dealing with the Crown Court's backlog and picking up the pieces of the mess that his government left behind. He'll know that the changes I made to Magistrates' Court sentencing powers also have freed up capacity in the Crown Courts, and we have increased funding for legal aid, criminal legal aid, by 92 million so that we have the money to underpin the system. That is action. That is an increase in sitting days in year and an unprecedented increase in sitting days for the next year. That's what this Labour government is delivering. And he will also know that even if we were sitting at the maximum judicial capacity, which is right to refer to, the Lady Chief Justice has referenced in Parliament herself, even at maximum judicial capacity, that backlog is still going to rise. And that is because the demand coming into the system is fast outstripping the pace at which cases are being disposed of. And so knowing that, it would be unconscionable if I stood before this House and behaved as if resources alone were going to fix the problem. That is why Sir Brian Leveson is considering once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts. It's the combination of the steps I've already taken, the funding I've now allocated, and the review that will lead to once-in-a-generation reform. That's what a plan looks like to fix the messes government left behind. It's a plan that they could have done when they were in government. They failed to do so, and now they carp from the sidelines when somebody else is actually getting on with the job. And then let me just say finally, as somebody who's of an ethnic minority background myself, I do not stand for any differential treatment before the law for anyone of any kind, and there will never be a two-tier sentencing approach under my watch or under this Labour government.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate the Lord Chancellor on the figures she's announced and on starting to get to grips with her baleful inheritance, but there's a long way to go. The Lady Chief Justice told the Lords Constitution Committee last week that she was pressing for Crown Courts to sit to capacity. Does the 110,000 figure represent capacity? If not, what is capacity? And given the backlog is 73,000 cases and rising, will she guarantee sitting days up to capacity for the whole of the coming year? In her statement, she rightly promises investment in the family and civil courts to bring those jurisdictions at or close to maximum capacity. Will she make the same commitment for the Crown Court?
Well, he will know that there is a difference between the system capacity and what is termed maximum judicial capacity. He is right. The Lady Chief Justice has said that the maximum judicial capacity is 113,000 sitting days in the Crown. We are funding 110,000 sitting days in the Crown. That is because I, in my role as Lord Chancellor, have to be mindful of the wider system capacity that can be managed. That is to say, the availability not just of the judges to sit in the Crown Court, but also the lawyers, the prosecutors, the availability of legal aid and the defence barristers that underpin the rest of the system as well. I am confident that the 110,000 sitting days represents the system capacity, and that is what is being delivered.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Josh Babrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tens of thousands of victims and survivors waiting for their day in court is one of the darkest legacies of the last Conservative government. I sincerely feel this because under that Conservative government, I was one of those victims. After 2 decades of agonising over whether to report my own victimhood as a child, I waited 2 years for my own opportunity to seek justice in the Crown Court. That's years of your heart racing whenever you get a phone call from an unknown number. Is it the court? Is it the CPS? Years of anxiety that your perpetrator will retaliate. Years of your life excruciatingly on hold. But many victims today are being forced to sit with all of this for far longer than I did. And so Liberal Democrats and myself personally welcome the Justice Secretary's announcement today. But we all know that a huge backlog will still remain, which means victims and survivors will continue to be let down. And at a time when victims and survivors need more support during these agonising waits, government funding cuts and the NICS increases are putting services like Safeline and victim support at risk. So will the Lord Chancellor outline year by year her targets for reducing this backlog, and will she increase, not cut, support for charities to ensure that victims and survivors get the support that they need and deserve?
Secretary of State.
Can I thank the member, the honourable gentleman, for his remarks and pay tribute to the bravery that he has shown in his own personal life as he has sought justice for the crimes committed against him. His journey reflects that of many people, too many people across our country. I have my own constituency experience of the people I represent directly whose cases are trapped in the Crown Court backlog, so I hear regularly of the impact that it is having, and I'm very alive to the human cost of that Crown Court's backlog. That is why, at every available opportunity, I have sought to make progress in increasing funding and allocation in year, and also this record settlement for the next year. But of course, I know we need to go further. I know we need to do more. That is why the work of Sir Brian Leveson is so crucial, because we know that without reform, no matter how much you sit to in the Crown Court, that backlog is still going to rise. And I hope that when that review reports, I can count on support for that reform from across this House. All that want to see the Crown Court backlog come down will want to do so, I hope. I would just say to him on victims funding, we have protected funding for victims of rape and serious sexual offences, as well as domestic abuse. That funding is ring-fenced, and we will shortly be setting out our victims bill, which will have further measures in it to strengthen the Victims Code. And he asks about targets and timelines, and forgive me, this was also a point raised by the Shadow Justice Secretary. I have committed to once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts. Once the review that Sir Brian Leveson is conducting has reported and the government has made decisions on the recommendations it will take forward and has got ready legislation, we will be able to set out the impact of future legislation in terms of bringing down that Crown Courts backlog.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely flabbergasted with some of the things that the Shadow Minister has said today. And I can assure him that this backlog has not just materialised over the last 8 months. I can say that. I can say that as a Crown prosecutor that worked throughout the last 14 years under this last government, where we saw the waiting lists go up and up and up, despite the best efforts of the hard-working staff throughout the criminal justice service. So can the Lord Chancellor today confirm that the measures that she has announced today will finally allow victims, including those in my constituency of Amber Valley, to have some confidence that there's finally a government that is going to tackle this issue?
Thank my honourable friend for her question. Flabbergasted is one way of describing it. It's probably the only one that would be found in order for Mr. Speaker, so I shall refrain from using other language. She is a former prosecutor herself. She knows of what she speaks, and I pay tribute to the work that she did in her previous profession. I think the message should go out loud and clear to her constituents and people up and down this country. This government is acting to deal with the Crown Court's backlog. We have a plan, we've increased funding, and we're considering the reform that is needed that's been ducked by too many others to get this system sorted out once and for all.
Sir Julian Smith.
I refer the House to my register of voluntary interests. I welcome the statement. Would she agree that one way of getting cash into the criminal system is to reduce the cost of the civil system? And could I urge her to continue to look at methods of alternative dispute resolution, and particularly mediation within the civil system?
I thank him for his comments. He's absolutely right. All mechanisms at our disposal to reduce the cost of people going to court should be on the table. We've already been acting to try and amplify the availability of mediation and other ways in which issues can be resolved. Going to court is always very expensive, sometimes for the individuals involved, often for the taxpayer, and it's important that we keep bearing down on those costs.
Rinda Juss.
First of all, please thank the Lord Chancellor for her honesty in laying out clearly the difficult situation that we have inherited from the party opposite. And I welcome the measures that she has proposed, the record investment in the justice system, and the measures taken to reduce the number of cases that will be going into the Crown Court. And it has got worse because of the party opposite. Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that in addition to the measures that she has already proposed, that we should continue focusing on reducing crime in the first place, such as pursuing our policies of tackling youth crime, knife crime, and tackling violence against women and girls?
Well, my honourable friend is right that in order to deal with all of the problems within the criminal justice system, whether that's in policing, with prosecutors, with the situation in the Crown Courts, we need a system-wide approach, and that does mean taking action on the sorts of crimes that affect neighbourhoods up and down the country. That's why the Home Secretary's recent Crime and Policing Bill will be such a landmark piece of legislation. We all have to play our part because the criminal justice system has been left in a truly terrible state by the previous administration, and this government is getting on with the job of sorting it out.
Sir Christopher Cho.
This announcement is small beer, isn't it? The £92 million extra offered for criminal legal aid is exceeded 20-fold by the subsidies given to offshore wind, which is £1.9 billion last year alone. Why is it that the government has such perverse priorities? And when are we going to put the criminal justice system above the interests of offshore wind operators?
We're talking about the highest ever funded allocation in the Crown Courts at 110,000 Crown Court sitting days. That is a record. He says small beer. I wonder if he's been imbibing something before getting on his feet.
Cox.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the Lord Chancellor's announcement of additional sitting days. The Justice Select Committee has been looking into the court backlog issue, and we've also been hearing about the ongoing need for digitisation of court and wider criminal justice processes. We need to replace a creaking paper-based system which is contributing to those delays. So will the Lord Chancellor continue to support drives to successfully digitise these processes? And would she also join with me in congratulating the party opposites for marking International Women's Day with such style?
She's absolutely right on the point on digitisation and efficiency. I've already funded, after the first phase of the spending review ongoing work to improve digitisation within all of our courts processes. She's right, we absolutely need to move away from such paper-based and paper-heavy systems that we have at the moment. Part 2 of Brian Levison's work, which will report in autumn, will be looking at cross-system efficiency as well. She's absolutely right. We do need to increase productivity and efficiency because that is the final piece of the puzzle if we're going to sort out the backlog.
Okay. Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the extra sitting days? And I also welcome the announcements about reform, but I hope the right to trial by jury, the ancient right that we have in this country, will remain. But can I ask the Lord Chancellor particularly to look at Somerset's Crown Court in Taunton? It was closed in 2023, after work began in 2022, when items were falling on the heads of the court from the ceiling. We've just been told another whole year it will be closed. And whilst that is closed for another 12 months, victims of crime will have to travel tens and tens of miles further. We have even court users sleeping under a bush because they can't travel back and forth. We need to get our Crown Court open. Will she please look at expediting those works to get our Crown Court open again?
I thank the Honourable Member for his question. I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with the Courts Minister to talk about the situation in Taunton.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm slightly worried about the party opposite, who appear to be the arsonists, who are now complaining that the fire brigade is turning up too late to put out the fire when they were the one that set it in the first place. And I do worry that they don't understand the magnitude of the challenge and scale that they left behind, because I've heard it from people in my own constituency who have been waiting years to have a court case, which is getting worse. But the honourable gentleman should take. If the honourable gentleman would spend more time providing leadership rather than auditioning for it, he would own up to his own failures in this House, and he would say how much the Conservatives left this country in a mess. But what I wanted to ask the Secretary of State is, courts aren't run just by judges. There is a lot of support staff in courts who make the court system run. So can she tell me what conversations she's had across government to make sure that those staff are also available, to make sure that as many courts are available as possible?
I think the Shadow Lord Chancellor is having such fun with his audition for leadership. It would be a shame to seek to deprive him of it. My honourable friend says they don't understand the party opposite, the mess they've left behind. I wonder, instead of they don't understand, they simply don't want to, because a party that was willing to reckon with the mistakes that they made in office would at least have started with some humility and perhaps an apology for the mess that they left behind. And he's right to point out that we're talking about a whole system approach. One of the reasons why the situation with the backlog is scheduled to get worse, no matter how many Crown Court sitting days you have, is because you've got an influx of cases into the system. That's actually a good thing because it means that the police are doing their job, prosecutions are being brought, but the rate of demand coming into the system is far outstripping, even at maximum capacity, the disposal of those cases. The case mix is more complex. It needs a system-wide response. That's what this government is providing.
Gavin Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When does the Lord Chancellor expect the additional places as being provided to start bearing down on the remand population?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right to refer to the issues with the remand population. To deal with the issues with the remand population, which is growing, it's currently at 17,000, has a big impact on prison capacity. That's why I increased magistrates' court sentencing powers a few months ago. It's why I've increased Crown Court sitting days, and it's why we've got the record allocation next year. The demand coming into the system is one of the reasons why bearing down on remand has been particularly challenging, but it's something that we continue to work with the judiciary on. Listings are, of course, a matter for the independent judiciary.
Mr.
Speaker, I would have expected a little bit more humility from the benches opposite. They left a legacy of chaos in our prisons, huge court backlog, and what we're dealing with here fundamentally is the backlog that they left behind. And the Minister has set out a process for dealing with the growing backlog, but it's ultimately lays at the door of the Conservative Party, who left the place in chaos. So does my right honourable friend think, shouldn't we be hearing an apology from the people opposite, rather than claiming some...
Sorry does seem to be the hardest word for the party opposite. I have long since stopped waiting for that apology. All I would observe, and I say this with 14 years of opposition experience under my belt, parties that don't acknowledge their own mistakes and sort themselves out rarely get elected.
Gavin Robbins.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and in welcoming the statement, can I say that it would reserve judgment on whether we need an additional court, an intermediary court, particularly if that's going to be resourced from the existing magistrates and Crown Court system. But can I ask the Lord Chancellor, particularly following on the question from Stratford, if we have a backlog in England, we have a backlog in Northern Ireland, and people are on remand for too long, increasingly people are being released following conviction with time served, and there's no opportunity for rehabilitation whatsoever. Will the opportunity to rehabilitate offenders whilst on remand form part of the Brian Levison review?
Well, look, he's absolutely right to raise the issues relating to remand. We do have a problem with the remand population. It's why I've already been making the changes that I've highlighted, and it's why the work of both reviews, the one being conducted by Sir Brian Levison, looking at once-in-a-generation court reform, and also by David Gorkin, the independent panel, looking at sentencing, is so crucial, because it is essential that not only do we bear down on the Crown Court backlog, but that we also get our prison capacity back into balance and have a sustainable prison system in this country.
Mr. Speaker, criminal justice was an easy target for Tory austerity cuts, and it always impacts the people with the smallest voice. Rape victims in Truro and Falmouth have come to me with waits of years for their cases to be heard and having hearings cancelled at the last minute. So I very much welcome this investment. I would ask for more detail on the case for a new court to sit between the magistrates and the Crown and how that may work.
On the possibility of a court that sits between the magistrates and the Crown, that's something that Sir Brian is considering, and she'll understand why I would want to wait until he has made his recommendations. But it's one of a range of options of different ways in which we could change policy in order to bear down in the long term on that Crown Court's backlog, and we will consider his recommendations and bring forward legislation for those that we want to take forward in the spring. And let me just say, look, I absolutely hear what she's saying about the terrible experience of victims who have their cases cancelled on the day, and the impact on rape victims in particular. It's one of the reasons why we've already gone ahead and fulfilled our manifesto commitment of having independent legal advisors for victims of rape, so that their specific rights in law are always protected.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lord Chancellor has been in office for 8 months today, and whilst her announcement of additional sitting days is welcome, it is regrettable she didn't make this statement 7 months ago. There is only so long that she can blame the last government for the Crown Court backlog. We all know that the pandemic was largely responsible for the very substantial increase. We know that the Lady Chief Justice has offered the Lord Chancellor a further 2,500 sitting days. Would she say why she's not taking advantage of that? There are currently too many people on remand for too long. And it's clear that even the announcement she's made today will not lead to a reduction in the backlog. So we need a structural change. So will the Lord Chancellor give serious consideration to the creation of an intermediate court so that we can reduce this backlog more quickly?
I would just gently remind him that the Concordat process that I have concluded with the announcements today is earlier than the one that I inherited from his party. So we have been cracking on. I've been getting on with the job. I increased sitting days immediately. I've taken every opportunity to increase sitting days further, and I've now made a record allocation. He says that the Lady Chief Justice has offered more sitting days. He'll know, of course, the Lady Chief Justice isn't able to offer sitting days. What she's able to comment on is maximum judicial capacity, which she has done so as is appropriate, in order to make sure that those sitting days are capable of being sat in the Crown Court. I have to consider the wider system capacity issues. That is about the availability of legal aid, it's about prosecutors, it's about defence barristers as well. That is why at the unprecedented record level of 110,000 Crown Court sitting days, I can say the system overall, not just judicial capacity, but the overall system has the capacity to meet these days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Public Accounts Committee published a report in which said the Razzo case, that's rape and serious sexual offences, were taking so many years to come to trial. When I was a Shadow Justice Minister for a number of years, at that dispatch box, I was asking the previous government day in, day out, as to what they were doing to try to reduce the court delays. 14 years, they did nothing. Now, this Lord Chancellor, in 8 months, has provided 110,000 court sitting days. So, would the Lord Chancellor agree with me that the expression that comes to mind is the case of the pot calling the kettle black?
I can tell my honourable friend that many expressions have come to mind as I've been listening. Some of the drivel from some of the members opposite, not all of which will not fall foul of Erskine May, so I will keep my counsel on that. She does refer to the Public Accounts Committee report, and I will just gently observe, I was a long-term member of that committee myself. I have the highest regard for the Public Accounts Committee, but I do reject the criticism they have made, because this is a government that clearly has a plan, not just on funding and resources for the Crown Court, but also on the reform that will ultimately be needed to get the system into balance.
Wild.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite this announcement, the backlog will increase, but when cases do go to court, it's important that offenders serve the sentence they're given. So following the Lord Chancellor's trip to Texas, where some prisoners serve as little as 25% of their sentence, will she rule out adopting such a soft sentencing policy?
Well, what I would say to him is that the experience of the Texans, who had similar problems to what we face today, but they had theirs 20 years or so ago, is that the system of good behaviour credits, which incentivises offenders to engage in rehabilitation activity, to get help for their drug addictions or their alcohol problems, mental health issues and so on, if they engage with that and get their good behaviour credits, that is how they earn their way to an earlier parole hearing. It isn't. It is the definition of a tough system because it says to offenders, you have to do something good in order to earn the possibility of an earlier release. It is a system that is well worth learning from because their reoffending rates are very low compared to ours. One of the prisons I visited in Texas has a reoffending rate of 17%. I would dream of that number for us here in this country because every time we bear down on reoffending, that is cutting crime and it's a strategy for making sure we have fewer victims in the future. I would hope that whatever proposals we bring forward, if they lead to a reduction in reoffending, those are proposals that he would back.
Mr. Speaker, in June 2024, in the dying days of the last Conservative government and after 14 years of their rule, there emerged the shocking statistic: 60% of rape victims were withdrawing from the court process, mainly because of court delays. Isn't that a damning indictment on any government that has taken power in this country? And what is she doing as a result of today's announcement that will help reduce that awful decision taken by so many rape victims?
He's absolutely right. The figures that he notes are a damning indictment of the legacy of the last Conservative government. The announcement we've made today will bear down on that court's backlog, and it will mean some rape victims get their cases heard as cases move through the system more swiftly. It's also why we've already implemented our manifesto commitment on independent legal advisors, because we know that in addition to delays, one of the things that causes many rape victims to drop out is inappropriate requests for personal information that go beyond what the law requires. And so those independent legal advisors will ensure that the rights in law of rape victims are respected and that the process does not feel like it is re-traumatising women who are already going through so much and who are waiting for their day in court to have justice done.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Harrow Crown Court has got 8 courtrooms and could help alleviate the capacity problems. Sadly, it's been closed since 2023 as a result of finding rack in the roof. It was supposed to open last year. It was then extended to April 2025 this year. It's now being said it won't open for a further year. So could the Justice Secretary then have a look at, with this improved funding, see if we can speed up the process of bringing back that court back into action and help the people who are now having to go to Willesden, Amersham, Southwark and all over London for their cases to be heard so they can get justice at a local level?
I absolutely understand his frustration and that of his constituents. I understand the problems at Harrow relate to RAC and the delays are due to contractor issues. I will make sure that we write to him with a full plan of what we anticipate will happen to get the Crown Court back into use. I hope he will recognise that we have a record investment also being announced today on Crown Court maintenance. It is up by £28.5 million and that will go some way to alleviating some of these maintenance issues.
Sean Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the last Conservative government, we saw reductions in Crown Court judges in Shropshire and Telford. We saw courtrooms empty for years while victims waited for years for their trials to take place. And now with Labour, we've got an extra Crown Court judge, a remand court back in the county, and extra Crown Court sitting times. I've heard from magistrates and Crown Court judges in my area that defendants are opting for Crown Court trials because they know it will take years to conclude. Can we make sure that does not happen in future? And Mr. Speaker, just in regards to the backlog, we should absolutely tackle the backlog. But can the Lord Chancellor give an assurance that we will not, unlike the last government, tell police officers to stop arresting people and put them before the courts?
I can absolutely give him that reassurance. This is the government that will deliver 13,000 extra neighbourhood police officers because we're absolutely clear that we need neighbourhood policing and bobbies back on the beat in this country. He's right to note that the size of the backlog and the structural problem with that backlog means that many defendants are gaming the system. And they know that they can take their chances, wait it out, and hope that either the victim gives up or for some other reason the case just simply never gets to court. That is why, in addition to the record funding, we have to consider once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the Lord Chancellor accept that part of the reason for a loss of public confidence are the sort of cases which are clogging up tribunal and court time, as are explained in his column in the Times today by Jawad Iqbal, involving dubious decisions about not being able to deport convicted criminals, such as an Iraqi cocaine dealer who can't be sent back to his homeland because he's considered to be too westernized. Quite apart from the perversity of the result, is it not an insult to genuine victims of crimes who are held up getting the judgments that they deserve?
Well, he'll know that I'm not going to. It'd be inappropriate for the Lord Chancellor to comment on individual judgments. But actually, in relation to some of the decisions in the immigration chamber, which have been the subject of some public discussion, he will know that the Prime Minister has been very clear that where there is a policy or a legal change that is required, it is for the government to bring forward those changes and for this House to ultimately vote on them. And in respect of that, the Home Secretary is considering further changes to the law. He mentioned deportations. Let me just remind him that under this government, deportations of foreign national offenders out of our prisons are up by 23%.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And like Chorley, Harlow Magistrates Court sadly closed in 2019. Can I thank the Lord Chancellor for her statement today? But would she agree with me that we need radical reforms to start driving down the Crown Court backlog, including the use of magistrate courts? As I say, sadly, we can't use Harlow at the moment, and so that we can get through cases quicker and give victims the justice they deserve.
I'm very much listening carefully and taking under advisement all of these lobbying requests, including from the Speaker himself about courts in their own areas. I thank both the Speaker and the Honourable Gentleman for that. He's absolutely right. We do need radical reform. Without radical reform, that backlog, no matter how much you fund in terms of Crown Court sitting days, is going to keep going up and up. And that is why Sir Brian Levison's work is so very crucial.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I speak as a member of the Public Accounts Committee that worked on the report Justice Delayed is Justice Denied, and I would recommend members peruse it. And it's on that point that I would ask the Lord Chancellor what specific conversations she's had with colleagues in the MHCLG about speeding up the planning process so that we can get more courtrooms operating.
We are speeding up the planning process.
Well, we are speeding up the planning process. The Courts Minister is in regular conversation with the Planning Minister. The issue in relation to Crown Court capacity, though, specifically is less one of planning and more of A, having enough days funded so that maximum use can be made of every available courtroom, but also recognising that there has to be some level of give in the system in terms of courtroom usage in order to enable the system to be run efficiently, because demand ebbs and flows at every court across the whole of the country, and so some spare capacity needs to be maintained. It is that spare capacity that enabled such a swift response to the summer riot. So I hope he will reflect on the fact that partly some usage is always going to be required, but in respect of the individual conversations, those are happening regularly between the Courts Minister and the Planning Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Lord Chancellor for her statement and the record funding. It's just a shame that the Shadow Justice Secretary, bereft of any policy ideas, has turned up today to basically tackle the man, in this case the woman, rather than play the ball. And I think a little bit of humility, contrition and a wholesome apology wouldn't go amiss. Does the Lord Chancellor agree that in allowing the backlog to spiral out of control, the previous government failed countless victims? And can she confirm that today's announcement means victims can have more confidence in justice system under Labour?
Well, let me just observe, I'm very happy to fight the Shadow Lord Chancellor, woman to man, anytime he likes. On the failure of the previous administration, I do think that members opposite should own up to that failure and apologise for it if they want to get a hearing from anybody in politics or indeed people in the country ever again. But what this government has shown is we are determined to clean up the mess that we inherited, and what victims across the country can take confidence in is that we have made record funding available and we are considering the structural reform that is required to sort this system out.
Matt Martin.
Speaker. When I speak with the police in Tunbridge Wells, they often comment that a large court backlog has a real effect on levels of crime. There are more criminals in circulation, and frankly, the system is seen as a bit of a soft touch if cases are never brought to court. Can I ask the Justice Secretary very simply, what is the backlog in Kent, and when will it be cleared? And if she doesn't have the figures to hand, would she be able to write to me with them?
Well, yeah, I'm very happy to write to him with the specific figures for Kent, but he will know the criminal justice system as a whole is under tremendous pressure and under extreme stress. That is because of the backlog. It's also because of the prisons' capacity crisis, all the legacy of the previous government, which we are now fixing.
Dave Robertson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is no surprise to me that I am the third MP from Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent that's taken part today, because in Staffordshire we now have 1,350 open cases waiting to be heard by Crown Courts. That has more than doubled over the last 5 years of Conservative mismanagement, and is the highest highest number since records began. I actually spoke to the police commander in Lichfield on Monday this week. One of his major concerns is that delays in justice being seen in courts is making his job harder in building the relationships that he needs to with our community. In the worst cases that he raised with me, there are cases of serious sexual assault and rape that are almost 5 years delayed. Can I ask the Secretary of State, what steps she will be taking to make sure that these additional extra sitting days are targeted at the most serious offenders?
Well, he raises a very important point. It's my job as Lord Chancellor to make sure that the overall settlement for Crown Court sitting days is sufficiently big in order to help drive down that Crown Court backlog, and that is why I've made the record allocation today. Listings specifically of individual cases, though, are of course a matter for the independent judiciary. It would be improper and inappropriate for me to comment on those listings decisions, but taken as a whole, in terms of both the investment that we're making and the reform that we are considering once the review of Sir Brian Leveson has reported, I think that he can take confidence in, his constituents can take confidence that this is a government that's going to sort this system out.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank very much the Lord Chancellor for increasing the sitting days to attempt to tackle the extremely large delays in court cases that we in the United Kingdom face, which is a sad reality for those seeking justice. The Lord Chancellor will know in Northern Ireland there are currently 18,907 pending cases in magistrates' courts, which is absolutely huge. So, given that the drastic increase in cases regarding violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland, can I very gently ask the Lord Chancellor what discussion the Honourable Lady has had with the Policing and Justice Minister to help reduce and address court cases and their delays in the province? Thanks so much.
It's always a pleasure to respond to the honourable gentleman. I thank him for his remarks welcoming the announcement today. The Parliamentary Under Secretary of State will be meeting with devolved Justice Ministers very soon, and we will update him on the work that we are doing with ministers in Northern Ireland.
Julia Buckley. Madam Deputy Speaker, and could I associate myself with the remarks of my honourable friend and neighbour, also from Shropshire, in welcoming today's much-needed funding announcement, and particularly those structural reforms to increase capacity. In my constituency of Shrewsbury, we currently have no working magistrates' court, despite being the county town for 350,000 residents. So will these reforms also enable and support the very pragmatic question of reallocating courtrooms between Crown and magistrates' use for areas like us in Shropshire? So when we're unlocking that spare capacity, it's quite specifically in towns like Shrewsbury that are better served by public transport for all of our rural population.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. The principle of local justice is incredibly important to this government, and we will endeavour to make sure that that is at the heart of all of our proposals and changes that we will make in the future. And we've also increased recruitment into the magistracy as well.
Lawrence Turner.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome today's announcement. Recruitment and retention challenges have limited access to justice in recent years. So can the Lord Chancellor outline what steps she is taking to ensure that we have enough barristers and solicitors so that courts get through as many cases as possible?
He's absolutely right to raise the question on availability of lawyers. That's why this government has already increased criminal legal aid by up to £92 million, and it's why we've increased the number of prosecutors as well, and we'll be bringing forward more changes in the upcoming Victims Bill to increase the availability of certain types of lawyers to do prosecution work.
Nessel Chalisken.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for her Secretary of State for her statement. As a member of the Public Accounts Committee, I've recently heard details of the shocking state of disrepair in recent years of our courts. And the most recent report identified the Nightingale courts that were set up under the previous government as a way to deal with the backlog of COVID. Many years on, those Nightingale courts, some of which still exist, and in some cases are costing 6 times more than a normal court. Can the Secretary of State give us reassurance that they will continue to close and that we can direct that money into the very courts that need the repairs?
My honourable friend raises an important point. We're keeping the situation in relation to Nightingale courts under review, where they're making a contribution that is assisting with case flow through the system. I think there is a case for keeping them, but it is something that is under review, and the Courts Minister will be happy to write to her with further details.
Jake Richards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've only been in this House for a few months, but I must admit I'm absolutely staggered by the chutzpah of the party opposite in their attitude to this issue. Most of them have left, but when they were here, their attitude to this issue. In a competitive field, the state of our criminal courts and our criminal justice system perhaps wins the award for the most acute crisis that is the result of the legacy of the last government. I really welcome the statement today, in particular the emphasis not just on capacity but productivity. Can I just push the government as to whether that approach will be taken also in our family courts? I welcome the investment into infrastructure and capital spend in family courts, but also we need to look at how we can improve productivity there too.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point on productivity, and it's why the second phase of Sir Brian Levison's work is so crucial. He'll know that we have expanded our Pathfinder pilot, which is a really important, and we think it's making a really important contribution to the flow of cases through the family court, and it's something that we're keeping under review.
That concludes the statements. Point of order, Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. There is real concern in Basildon and Billericay about the closure of the South Green surgery, and I've raised it in Parliament a couple of times, including oral questions, where the Health Secretary told me that this would be a matter for my ICB. And he would be happy to make some introductions. However, in a written response, a written question, the member for Aberfan, Health Minister, told me that there were new powers in the Health and Care Act 2022, which meant that the Secretary of State could indeed intervene with new powers introduced on the 31st of January, which were new powers introduced on the 31st of January 2024. This has caused real confusion amongst my own constituents, particularly 3,500 who've led a petition led by Justine Norris and Vivian Conway, and my excellent local councillors who've been doing all they can to raise this issue. What can the Speaker do to ensure that ministers don't give my constituents accidentally misleading answers to questions, and ensure that ministers will correct the record where they do make mistakes?
I am grateful to the honourable member for giving notice of his point of order. The Chair is not responsible for the content of ministerial answers, but he has made his point on the record, and there is a procedure for ministers to correct the record if they wish to do so. Point of order, Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. You will be aware that I have been campaigning on behalf of families affected by the drug Procedural for over 12 years. In December 2023, the government agreed to look at new evidence that links Procedural to babies that were born with deformities. In November 2024, the Commission on Human Medicine finally held a session with the experts to look at this new evidence. At that session, they were told that the conclusion of the review would be published in a matter of weeks. We're now in March. We have written on the to the department and tabled questions. How many months and years do these long-suffering families have to wait? There has been a long culture of dither and delay on this issue. I hope that the families will go away and they can all be buried and forgotten about. But this issue has a tremendous cross-party support from across the House. Can the Speaker advise me what more I can do to get the Department's attention on this matter?
I am grateful to the honourable member for giving notice of her point of order. This is not a matter for the Chair, but she has put her point on the record, and I'm sure that the Treasury bench will have noted what she has had to say. Point of order, Ellie Chowns.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, yesterday during my urgent question on Gaza, the Minister responding, the Honourable Member for Hornsey and Fry and Barnet and Under-Secretary of State for the Indo-Pacific, said that the Minister responsible, the Honourable Member for Lincoln and Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Middle East, Afghanistan and Pakistan, could not answer the question himself as he was in the region pushing for a peace deal. However, I've since received a communication from the press with evidence suggesting that he was at a Labour Party networking lunch at Ronnie Scott's at the time. Could you advise, Madam Deputy Speaker, on whether the record should be corrected if it is shown not to be correct?
I am grateful to the honourable member for giving notice of this point of order. Has she given notice to the members involved that she was going to raise this matter in the Chamber?
I have indeed, Deputy Speaker.
The Chair is not responsible for the content of ministerial answers, but she has put her point on the record, and there is a procedure for ministers to correct the record if they wish to do so. Point of order, Jim Shannon.
The Prime Minister rightly referred to the loss of life of the young soldiers, and it was right to do that and set the tone for this chamber and thank them. Deputy Speaker, 40 years ago on Friday past, the IRA launched a mortar attack from Corrie Square on Newry Police Station. How can it be recorded in this House that those 9 brave young RUC police officers were murdered? The biggest loss of RUC police life ever in the province can be recorded in this House. Their bravery, their courage, their determination, and their battle for us in this Northern Ireland to have the freedom and the peace that we now have. How can we record that? Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for his point of order. He has put his point on the record. We now move to the presentation of Bill. Presentation of Bill, Gareth Snell.
Thank you. Ceramics, Country of Origin Marking Bill.
Second reading what day?
25th of April 2025.
25th of April 2025. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Chris Vince.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring a bill to amend the Dentist Act 1984 in respect of indemnity arrangements. Like many new MPs in this place, I find the first bill that I'm presenting is not something that I have experience of, but something that was brought to me as an issue in my constituency. Clive Worthington was a much-loved resident in Harlow. He worked as a wood machinist and had 3 children and 5 grandchildren. And I thank my honourable friend from Lewisham East for introducing me to Clive's daughter Gina, who is her constituent. When I first met Gina, she described her father as fun-loving, full of life, someone who'd enjoyed sport and playing with his grandchildren. However, in 2008, Mr. Worthington had dental implants. Despite several follow-up operations in the years that followed, the procedure was unsuccessful and left Mr. Worthington in agony. Mr. Worthington was awarded £117,378 in damages and legal costs at Chelmsford County Court in November 2019, one of the highest payouts for dental negligence in the UK. However, the dentist who carried out the work was only covered via her membership of the Dental Defence Union, DDU. Organisations like the DDU are not insurance companies, but they offer professional indemnity on a discretionary basis for members against the risk of dental negligence claims and professional conduct proceedings. The British Medical Association describes discretionary indemnity as where legal and financial assistance is provided at the discretion of the provider. For example, not backed by an insurance contract between the healthcare professional and the provider. Due to this loophole, Mr Worthington did not receive compensation, and in 2022, unable to stand the agony and in feeling as though he had, and I quote, lost faith in the system, Mr Worthington took his own life. The senior Essex coroner said the long-term consequences of Mr Worthington's unsuccessful dental surgery impacted significantly on his mental health and ability to cope with daily life. His daughter Gina said, and I quote, "It's such a tragic end to a life. It just makes me so mad that it didn't have to end this way." Indemnity cover for healthcare professionals, including dentists, was subject of a consultation launched by the Department of Health in December 2018. To move forward and to build on the Patterson Inquiry recommendations and the wishes of Clive Worthington's daughter Gina, this bill is calling for an amendment to the Healthcare and Associated Professionals Indemnity Arrangements Order 2014 via secondary legislation. The following amendment does not require lengthy primary legislation. My proposal is an amendment of Section 26A of the Healthcare and Associated Professionals Indemnity Arrangements Order 2014. And it's, as I say, it's paragraph 4 and it's section 2 of that paragraph. Amendment of section 26A, paragraph 4, and it's part 2 of that, which currently reads, for the purpose of this section, an indemnity arrangement may comprise of A, a policy of insurance, B, an arrangement made for the purposes of indemnifying a person, or C, a combination of the two. My bill proposes that we will change that sentence to, for the purposes of this section, an indemnity arrangement must comprise of a policy of insurance.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
It will be Jen Craft, Josh Dean, Will Stone, Charlotte Nichols and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Vince.
Dentists Indemnity Arrangements Bill.
Second reading, what day?
18th of June.
18th of June.
Oh, 13th of June, sorry.
13th of June. We now come to Estimates Day. We will start with a motion on the supplementary estimate for the Department for Health and Social Care and the debate on the spending of the Department for Health and Social Care. The debate will be led by Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown. Minister to move formally.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for granting us this opportunity to debate this supplementary estimate, which will be an opportunity for all members of this House to look at the PAC report on health and discuss how the money might be spent in different priorities. So I'm honoured to introduce this debate as Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the first estimates debate on the supplementary estimate of the Department of Health and Social Care. I made this application jointly with the member for Oxford West and Abingdon, Chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, and my right honourable friend, the member for Salisbury and South Wiltshire. The Public Accounts Committee, as members of this House will know, is one of the oldest committees of this House and exists to protect taxpayers' money and ensure that their pound is being used effectively. I think it goes back to about 1867. Unlike other committees, we do not take evidence from government ministers, but we take evidence directly from permanent secretaries and the most senior civil servants and public sector officials. We use the National Audit Office to provide audited accounts and value for money reports, and we produce reports of our own with recommendations to government that they have to formally respond to as part of the Treasury Minute. At this point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to Amanda Pritchard, who has just announced that she will be stepping down as the Chief Executive of NHS England this summer. She has overseen the NHS at a time when it has been under so much pressure post-pandemic, and I wish her well in her future endeavours. I'd also like to congratulate Chris Wormold on his promotion to Cabinet Secretary. However, these vacancies at the head of NHS England and the department provide an opportunity for completely fresh thinking within the NHS. Yes, of course I'll give way to the
Very
Chair.
briefly, I'm very grateful to him for giving way. May I echo the thanks to Amanda Pritchard for her time at the head of NHS England, and would I also welcome the appointment of Dr Penny Dash as the new chair of NHS England. He is right to say that this is a really important moment in the future for the National Health Service.
Well, I thank the Chair of the Health and Social Care Committee for those endorsements on these very worthy work that these all individuals do put in the health service. So the Department of Health and Social Care is one of the highest spending departments in the UK, with a total departmental expenditure limit standing at a huge £210.1 billion. And I don't believe anybody believes that the NHS is working at optimal productivity. NHS England is the largest quango with the highest budget in Whitehall. However, when allocating funds, it is also one of the few departments that are making life and death decisions which affect the lives of literally millions of patients and their families. Therefore, I think it does deserve the highest level of scrutiny, which is part of what we're doing today. Before even getting onto the figures, the NAO confirmed that the level of productivity in the NHS has dropped by around 23% since the pandemic. And I simply say that unless this is sorted, any reform that the government announces will be sucked into the black hole of the NHS without getting commensurate value for money or results. I will give way. I don't want to give way to too many people, otherwise the Speaker will reprimand me for taking too long. But of course, I'm happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Giving way. And on that point specifically, I was at my local hospital, County Hospital in Stafford, just a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed that they were still using paper to make notes, paper notes for patients. And actually, it's one of the biggest barriers into us being able to become more efficient in the NHS is our inability to have effective digital systems. Would he agree with me that the investment that's been announced into the NHS is long overdue in terms of moving ourselves from analogue to digital?
I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady. She's obviously been reading my speech, so if she... the announcement will come later in my speech, and then she'll know exactly what it says. Before even getting on to the figures, the NAO confirmed that the level, as I say, of productivity has dropped by 23%. So I welcome the government's commitment to a 10-year plan for the NHS. We've also repeatedly warned that an ageing and increasingly sick population, the NHS will struggle to cope with an ever-increasing multiple complex demands of our populations. So I'd like to split this speech into three sections about how productivity could be improved in the NHS, funding, and as the Honourable Lady alluded to, technical advancements and a shift into community care. The Department of Social Care's day-to-day spending, RDEL, is set to increase by £10.9 billion, from £187.9 billion to the main estimate, as produced today, of £198.5 billion. However, the worrying thing about the estimates today is that capital spending is set to decrease by around £1 billion, from £12.5 billion to £11.5 billion, a decrease of 8%. This is worrying, as it shows more and more funds are being redirected from long-term investment, for example in new hospitals, that the previous government had committed to. Yeah. And I welcome the Treasury guidelines that have stopped the practice of redirecting up to £1 billion in the last few years from capital to day-to-day spending, and that will mean that more money should be put into spending in that way. So the NHS estate, as we all know from our constituencies, is in desperate need of investment, and our capital investment programme is running behind schedule. The problems with RAC have only added to the necessity of upgrading our hospitals, and I hope the Minister will listen to this plea. In the latest NAO report on the DHSC and the DHSC annual report and accounts shows that local systems, i.e. ICB and NHS providers, reported a year-end overspend of 1.4 billion. This has nearly doubled from 621 million in 22-23. And this was despite an extra 4.5 billion of additional funding during 23-24, which was to support pay deals for non-medical staff, mitigate any impacts from industrial action, and money to address the costs of new pay arrangements for doctors and dentists. Whilst I do not think it's acceptable, the glacial pace in agreeing priorities and approving final budgets for the local systems. And in November, our committee was shocked to hear that in the last 2 years, those local systems, ICB and others, had not had their financial plans approved by the department until June and May, respectively. That is 3 to 2 months after the beginning of the year end. So how can our poor local systems plan efficiently when these final allocations and guidance are so late? However, if the department's main accounts were finalised much sooner, it would mean that our local systems would be able to have their money allocated in a more timely way, and therefore wastage and inefficient spending would be much less likely to occur. So I welcome the Secretary of State's prognosis that the NHS is far too big and complicated. There should be a shift towards allowing NHS trusts more control of their own budgets, as clarified in the 25-26 priorities and operational planning guidance that was published in January. I believe that by moving more funds directly to NHS trusts and ICBs and local systems will improve accountability and give them a level of flexibility about how their funds should be spent better, rather than just focusing on targets and directives. For example, if they were to run a surplus because they'd run their operations so well, rather than returning this money to Whitehall, they could reinvest it in capital projects that are desperately needed. And this also goes hand in hand with a need to improve productivity. So between 1996 and 2019, the NHS averaged a measly 0.6% year increase in productivity. Since the pandemic, the productivity has now fallen by 23%. And in March 24, the Conservative announcement that the NHS would receive £3.4 billion of capital investment for digital improvements between 25 and 26 and 27-8. This begins to start to address the point the Honourable Lady was mentioning. As part of this investment, NHS England is committed to achieving an ambitious average productivity improvements of 2% through the years 29 to 30. Just a second. However, those digital improvements that presaged by that additional £3.4 billion have not yet been fully actioned. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
To give way, and I thank you for his speech and the scrutiny he's giving the NHS, which I think is really, really important. I wonder if he would agree with me that part of the issues we're talking about with productivity, and he reflected on the fact that that has been made worse, since the pandemic, is to do with the mental health of staff, and actually that's something that needs to be looked at. And supporting our NHS professionals to be as productive as they possibly can be includes looking after their health and their mental health as well.
That's exactly right. The NHS employs an enormous number of staff, over 1 million people, I think. And of course, their conditions of work are really important if we are to retain them. And that does mean that their mental health needs close attention where they have got problems. And if the NHS can't help with mental health, who can? So I think the Honourable Gentleman hit on a really important point, actually. One of the reasons that productivity is not improving more is that there are 19% more staff in the NHS, but they're only seeing 14% more patients. At our hearing, the NHS officials stated that this was due to more complex and acute health needs, meaning longer stays in hospital. But I also understand, to the Honourable Gentleman's point, that it was due to staff sicknesses, absences, and the ongoing then workforce industrial action that affected most patients last year, making targets more difficult to meet. And I'm still, I don't know about other honourable members, I'm still getting emails from constituents who have had their appointments on operations cancelled at the last minute due to that industrial action, and they're still waiting for their procedures to be rearranged. So along with staff, technology plays a big role in improving efficiency and productivity. And in 25/6, the priorities and operation planning guidance that the government stated that the NHS organisation will need to reduce their cost base by at least 1% and achieve 4% improvement in their productivity. Now, I understand that these figures are hard to pin down due to the NHS still negotiating with bodies like the ONS on precisely what the definition of productivity is and how it can be measured. So even if the numbers for productivity are disputed, we've still not seen, and I would say this to the Minister on the front bench today, we've still not seen a plan about how these productivity gains can be achieved, and the committees believe that NHS England have produced unrealistic estimates. So we really need to know what is the government's, the department's realistic estimate of what productivity gains can be achieved over the next few years. Without significant productivity gains, the NHS will not substantially reform waiting times and achieve best value for money for the very large amount of money we spend on it. We spend, on average, around 4% increase in real terms each year, when the economy is only growing at 1%, which is completely unsustainable in the long run. If we go back to 2013, the Secretary of State for Health had set a challenge to the NHS to go paperless by 2018. Clearly, as we all know, this has not happened because the NHS is still using fax machines. In a digital age of AI, this lack of modernisation produces a risk to patients and a risk to employees in the NHS. Investing in better technology would help with the government's ambition to shift more care into the community. Community health care can take many forms, from GP surgeries, community hospitals, pharmacies, dentists, social care, and so much more. I fear that when we talk about the NHS budget, we predominantly focus on hospital care, rather than the care that most of our constituents need every day. And indeed, Lord Darcy, in his report that was commissioned by this government last year, said that the NHS budget is not being spent where it should be. Too great a share being spent in hospitals, too little in the community, and productivity is too low. And this is where I'd like to pay tribute to our GPs and all their staff across the country, especially in the North Cotswolds. Our GP surgeries are usually the first point of contact with our NHS. From antenatal services, blood tests, vaccination, and so much more, they offer a number of services that could be termed as preventative care. Now, we as a committee did question NHS officials on their prioritisation of preventing ill health rather than treating it, and avoid much more expensive hospital interventions in the future and a much better patient experience. And their reply was that they had little additional headroom to grow preventative services. Yet the public health grant used by local authorities to commission preventative measures such as health visitors and drug and alcohol services is expected to fall in value next year by 193 million, despite the government's commitment to maintaining it in real terms. I really can't stress enough, Madam Deputy Speaker, how I believe that we should be paying much more attention to prevention rather than cure. It is so important. NHS England said that rather than moving funds, there should be a focus on the role of GPs and how they can advise their patients. Although, according to the Royal Society of General Practitioners, more than 90% of patients' direct experience of the NHS is through primary care and GP practices, but currently less than 10% of that total budget is spent on primary care. I just do think, and I say to the Minister very gently, we're getting our priorities wrong here. So as a committee, we've recommended that the government should clearly define what counts as health prevention spending within the next 6 months and track that spending annually. ICB should also be given more flexibility as how they can spend their money, which might, for example, include redirecting to more community settings who are closer to patients. It might also include redirecting funds to help manage discharges from hospital. And according to the House of Commons Library, the latest data shows that an average of 12,340 patients per day last year remained in hospital despite being clinically fit to be discharged. And even though there is a slight decrease from last year of 1.2%, I do believe that more can be done to ensure patients who are well enough can leave hospital into the community and be closer to their families. This will require better working between social care and hospitals. I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member who's making a very powerful case for reforms and review. The Select Committee this morning, in fact, were looking at this very issue in respect of delayed discharge of medically fit patients. But does he not accept that, in fact, what we need is more integration? Because if only a quarter of those delayed discharges are down to a lack of social care package, many of those patients can't be discharged because they have a primary health care condition which needs to be taken care of, and that therefore it's actually integration and not just social care that needs to be reformed.
The honourable member makes an extremely powerful point. I'm coming to the conclusion of my speech, and it is on precisely that point. The social care system is not working in this country. It is a political football that keeps being passed from one government to the other. I understand the government has committed to another review of adult social care, where we won't expect results until at least 2028. For many of our elderly patients, this will be too late. The funding of social care is rising exponentially, and I believe there needs to be more focused and joined-up thinking from both DHSC, NHS England and local authorities on how they can support those that need the help to be discharged from hospital in a timely manner and live in their own home for a longer period than they might otherwise be able to. It should not be a postcode lottery that exists now. In conclusion, with more joined-up thinking between different parts of the NHS, I believe the patient experience could be better. However, without substantial increases in productivity, increase in spending on preventative care and public health, with a better functioning social care system, our NHS will never be able to operate at an optimum level at world-leading standards.
I do want to try to get everybody in, so I'm going to start with an immediate 5-minute time limit. I call Clive Betts.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. Though we sit on opposite sides of this chamber, we spend most of our time in this place now on the same side of the table in the committee. And I welcome and congratulate him on his appointment and the work that he's doing as chair. The very clear remit from the Secretary of State is move to prevention, a move to community care, and move to digital services. That's what it's laid down as. I think when we had the officials from the Department and NHS England before us, what we said, we thought they were complacent about the NHS finances. I have to say, I thought there was no sense of purpose or long-term strategy to deliver on the Secretary of State's objectives. That was the real worrying thing. And if you look now at the immediate problems, you've got a service where trusts and others can run up deficits and seemingly there's no consequence. Unlike local government, where you have to balance the books, otherwise you go to government for approval to capitalise losses. Doesn't happen in the NHS. So you have the problem in South Yorkshire where Doncaster Hospital runs a loss every year. I'm not blaming the hospital there because they've got an old building that needs massive refurbishment, probably rebuilding completely. They haven't had the resources, but those losses mean they go into the wider ICB system, and then it puts pressure on other hospitals, other trusts, to actually not distribute any surplus they might make to community services where it should go in Sheffield, but actually to fund others' losses. That's no way really to incentivise a proper financial arrangement. Absolutely right on moving towards community services. That's not just to get people out of hospital, it's actually to stop them going into hospital in the first place. And that's what certainly could be done. GPC 90% of appointments and get 10% of the funding. It clearly is wrong. We've got to switch that. Social care, again, the Health and Social Care Select Committee and the Levelling Up Select Committees it then did a joint report around 8 years ago now. 22 members of Parliament signed up. You know, we're still here talking about the funding. Now, I think Louise Case is a great appointment, Louise Casey's got a great get up and go attitude. I'm sure she could be asked to get up and go a bit before 2028 because that's a long time to wait for any response. We should be looking a lot more about moving services out of hospitals. There is a proposal around, and I say around because the NHS doesn't tend to act very quickly, for a diagnostic centre at Crystal Peaks in my constituency. The south east of Sheffield is a long way from the 2 teaching hospitals, so to put services there like MRI scans and ultrasound scans, X-rays, CT scans, and GPs working with consultants who come to see patients in their clinics in the community would actually save money and provide a better patient service, but it seems to get locked up in the NHS financing about the commissioning and who gets paid what to see who when. Really, we've just got to unravel that and recognise that services can be made to improve significantly. Digitisation, of course, the fax machines are legendary, but the other week I had to change a hospital appointment a couple of times. They're really helpful in changing it. I didn't merely get 3 emails and 3 texts. I actually had 3 letters in the first class stamp on them, all for one appointment. This is just a complete waste of money. Talking to the hospital in Sheffield, they're bringing new IT systems to cover the whole of the hospital operation, but it doesn't link into the GP systems. I mean, this is just a nonsense in this day and age that we can get to that sort of unjoined up thinking. A couple of other issues I could raise. The consultants who's been treating me for the last 7 years, hopefully very successful at this stage, for my myeloma, has got an idea that given you have to have so much chemotherapy, which you go through, probably at least 6 different sessions, 2 twice a week, then people have to go into the day ward to get those sessions. All right for some people. They've very helpfully rearranged my timetable to suit me coming down here and going back. For many people, that isn't possible, particularly if they're coming to a specialist unit many, many miles away. He's developed an idea for home chemotherapy. It works, it's good. Certainly, I'll just give away very briefly to
my deputy, who does an excellent job on the Public Accounts Committee. Before he joined the committee in the last Parliament, we went to Denmark, and they do precisely what he's just saying. Treat chemotherapy in people's home where they have a history of not reacting to it.
Absolutely, obviously done with the clinician's approval and with the patient's agreement. This idea has been around for 2 years now. It's again lost in the labyrinth of NHS discussions and boards and committees. Come on, let's do it now. It's a good idea. It actually is cheaper and it benefits the patient. So why can't these ideas be got up and moving much more quickly? Public health, absolutely agree with the comments that were made. It's like an afterthought. You know, the grant for public health comes out at least 2, 3, 4 months after the main grants for the NHS and for local government. It's like the money down the back of the sofa that the Treasury finds at the last minute. And over the years, in real terms, it's been cut significantly. Public health in Sheffield do an absolutely great job. They work with the NHS Sheffield Place. They've done some really good work in the north of Sheffield in very deprived communities, increasing and improving community care. That's the sort of initiative we ought to follow and pursue and give the ICB the wherewithal to actually support and engage with it. But equality of treatment is something, just my final point, that we ought to build into our aspirations. In Sheffield, you go from one end of the city to another, and life expectancy changes by 10 years. That's simply not acceptable. Yet when we come to look at child vaccinations, GPs get paid by the number of vaccinations they do, which actually means that those GPs with the easy patients to reach in probably wealthier areas get a lot more money for doing the vaccinations than those who are really struggling to engage with deprived communities. That sort of initiative from the NHS is wrong, and we need to correct it.
Oh, John Glenn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a privilege to make a contribution in this important seasonal debate, and I would pay tribute to my friend, the member for North Cotswolds, for bringing this debate to the House, and I would commend him on the work that he's doing, chairing the Public Accounts Committee. And as he set out, there are a number of enduring challenges that the NHS faces. Productivity, the integration of different systems, the challenge of public health, and the enduring issue of social care and how local authorities can actually provide the space for the NHS to deliver some of the outcomes that we all aspire to. Now, I spent some of my time prior to the election in the Treasury, and every fiscal event that I was part of, in whether it was a PPS to a Chancellor, as an Economic Secretary or as Chief Secretary, more money was given to the NHS. An attempt was made before every fiscal event to ensure that all the relevant stakeholders made the right positive statements about the new commitments made. And yet, 6 months or 12 months later, there was another pressing financial challenge. And I say that because it is frustrating. We all come to this place to try and find enduring solutions to problems that, you know, are quite complicated. And I wanted to make some observations about the challenges of multiple systems operating effectively in allocating resources. In my own constituency, I met with, and I'm sure we all do, meet with GPs regularly. And I met with Dan Henderson, who's a partner at Salisbury Medical Practice. And he, alongside Anna Morton, who's a practice manager,